The moment a man laughs at his wife in public is the moment he loses everything. He just doesn't know it yet. The chandelier light spilled like liquid gold across the grand ballroom, catching on crystal glasses and diamond smiles, but none of it touched Imani Brooks as she stood beside her husband, still as a shadow, her black dress absorbing the light instead of reflecting it, simple, precise, deliberate, as if she had chosen invisibility as her armor. Alexander Hayes, worth more than most men in the room combined, lifted his glass with effortless authority, the kind built over years of control and admiration, his voice smooth, practiced, admired, until it turned cold. Some people, he said, eyes drifting toward her without truly seeing her, are invited into a life they were never meant to understand, and a ripple of polite laughter followed, soft at first, then sharper, encouraged by his smile, by the permission of power, by the comfort of belonging. Imani didn't move, not when the laughter grew louder, not when a woman in emerald silk leaned closer to whisper something cruel behind a jeweled hand, not even when Alexander set his glass down and added, quieter but clearer, "Tonight, I'm correcting a mistake." And just like that, the room shifted, curiosity sharpening into attention into spectacle, because everyone loved a fall when it wasn't theirs. She turned her head then, slowly, her eyes meeting his for a single second, and there was no anger there, no pleading, no fracture, only something still, something measured, something that didn't belong to the moment at all. The music continued, violins threading through tension, waiters moving like ghosts, but the air had changed, thinner now, as if something unseen had entered the room. Alexander didn't notice. Of course he didn't. Men like him rarely did. He was already turning away, already accepting congratulations disguised as sympathy, already stepping forward into a future he believed he controlled. Imani adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, a small, almost invisible gesture, the kind no one would remember. And then she stepped back, one step, then another, heels soft against marble, leaving the circle of light without sound, without resistance, without explanation. No one stopped her, no one called her name, because to them she had never been the center of anything, just a quiet presence orbiting a brighter star. But near the far edge of the room, a man in a dark suit paused mid-conversation, his gaze locking onto her with sudden recognition, subtle, controlled, gone in a blink, yet real enough to send a quiet ripple through something unseen. Imani reached the doors, her hand resting briefly on the cool brass handle, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself a breath, slow, steady, as if the world beyond those doors operated on a different set of rules, rules she understood far better than anyone inside ever could. Behind her, laughter resumed, louder now, careless, convinced of its permanence. She didn't look back, not once, because the story they thought had ended was only just beginning, and somewhere far beyond the reach of chandeliers and champagne, something far more powerful had already been set in motion. The city outside had already begun to forget her, but power never forgot its own. The night air wrapped around Imani Brooks as she stepped onto the quiet street, the echo of laughter fading behind closed doors, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the soft glow of streetlights stretching down the avenue like a path drawn just for her. She did not rush, did not hesitate, her heels steady against the pavement as if each step had been calculated long before tonight ever existed. A black car waited at the curb, unmarked, unremarkable to anyone passing by, but the moment she approached, the driver stepped out without a word, opening the door with a precision that spoke of training, not service, and for a brief second, his posture shifted, straighter, sharper, not toward a guest, but toward someone of rank. Imani paused, her reflection caught in the tinted glass. The woman looking back at her no longer belonged to the ballroom she had just left, she belonged to something quieter. Something deeper, something that did not need validation to exist. Inside the gala, Alexander Hayes stood surrounded by people who suddenly spoke louder than before, filling the silence her absence had left. His name still carried weight, his smile still commanded attention, but something small had shifted, subtle enough to ignore, sharp enough to linger, a question he could not quite place. Why had she not reacted? Why had she not pleaded? Why had she not even looked back? He dismissed it with a sip of aged whiskey, the burn grounding him in certainty. This was control, this was order, this was how things were meant to be, across the city. Inside the quiet of the car, Imani folded her hands in her lap, her fingers still, her breathing even. The driver spoke once, his voice low, respectful. "Ma'am, headquarters has been notified," and she gave a slight nod, nothing more, because explanations were unnecessary, Everything had already been set in motion hours before the first glass had been raised in that ballroom. A phone vibrated softly beside her, the screen lighting up with a single name. She did not answer immediately, letting it ring once, twice, then she picked it up, her voice calm, measured. Proceed. One word, no emotion, yet the effect on the other end was immediate, a chain reaction beginning somewhere far beyond the city lights, invisible to those who believed power only existed in wealth and applause. Back at his penthouse, Alexander stood before floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline glittering beneath him, a kingdom he believed he had built alone, his reflection sharp against the glass, confident, untouchable, and yet, for the first time, sleep did not come easily, his mind circling back to that single moment, the way she had looked at him, not with pain, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, something that felt like finality. Morning would come, as it always did, bringing with it meetings, deals, numbers that confirmed his place at the top, but what he did not know, what he could not yet see, was that somewhere within those same morning hours, doors would open without warning, voices would change in tone, and the name he had dismissed so easily would begin to move through rooms he had never been invited into. And when that moment arrived, when reality finally aligned with truth, the man who believed he controlled everything would understand what silence had been hiding all along. Morning arrived with a precision that felt almost rehearsed, sunlight cutting through the glass walls of Hayes Global like a spotlight on a stage that had already begun to shift beneath its lead actor. Alexander Hayes stepped out of his car expecting the usual rhythm of control, assistants moving quickly, greetings sharpened with respect, the quiet hum of a company that responded to his presence. But something was different, subtle at first, the way conversations paused half a second too long. The way eyes met and then quickly looked away, not fear, not yet, but uncertainty, a crack so fine it could be ignored if one chose not to look too closely. Inside the executive floor, the air felt colder, not in temperature but in tone, as if the building itself had received information its owner had not. His assistant approached with a tablet held slightly tighter than usual, her voice composed but lacking its usual confidence. There has been a request, sir, a federal request. The word lingered longer than it should have, and for a moment, Alexander did not respond, not because he did not understand, but because he had never needed to. Requests were things he approved, not things he received. He took the tablet, scanning quickly, the language formal, precise, controlled, the kind that did not invite negotiation, only compliance, and yet there was no accusation, no explanation, only a directive that something within his company required immediate review. He handed the tablet back without comment, his expression unchanged, because power did not react, it absorbed, it calculated, it waited. Across the city, in a building that did not carry a name on its exterior, Imani Brooks stood before a window that overlooked nothing in particular, no skyline, no spectacle, just a quiet stretch of structured anonymity, her reflection steady, her posture exact. As a man in a dark suit entered behind her, his steps measured, respectful. Everything is in place, he said, and she nodded once, the same controlled acknowledgement she had given the night before, because timing was not about urgency, it was about precision. Back at Hayes Global, the first arrival was almost unnoticeable, a black vehicle pulling into a reserved space, followed by another, and then another, each one identical in its lack of identity. Security noticed, of course they did, but protocol did not allow for interference without instruction, and instruction had not yet come. Inside, Alexander stood at the head of a conference table, speaking in numbers, projections, confidence, the language he had mastered. But even as he spoke, the room was no longer entirely his, attention fractured, drawn towards something outside the glass walls, something approaching with quiet inevitability. Then the doors opened, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a calm authority that did not need to announce itself, and the room fell into a silence that felt heavier than any noise. A group of individuals stepped inside, suits dark, expressions unreadable, movements synchronized not by design but by discipline, and in that moment, something shifted completely, not just in the room, but in the understanding of it. Alexander turned, his voice ready, his authority prepared, but the words did not come as easily as they always had, because for the first time, he was not the highest presence in the room. The lead agent stepped forward, his gaze steady, not hostile, not deferential, simply certain, and as he spoke, his tone carried a weight that did not ask for permission. We will need your full cooperation, and it was not the request that unsettled the room, it was the realization that followed, quiet, undeniable. that whatever had begun the night before had already moved beyond anything money could contain, and somewhere just beyond the glass, beyond the reach of every assumption he had ever made, the woman he had dismissed had already stepped into a position he could not yet see, but would soon be forced to face. Control does not collapse all at once, it fractures in moments so small they are almost invisible until they are not. Alexander Hayes stood at the head of the table, shoulders squared, expression steady, but the rhythm of the room no longer followed him, it followed them, the agents who had entered without hesitation and without the slightest regard for status, their presence quiet yet absolute, as if authority itself had taken form and stepped across his polished floors. He gestured toward a chair, offering composure where dominance had once been enough. "You can direct any inquiries through legal," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, the same voice that had closed deals worth hundreds of millions. But it landed differently now, not ignored, not challenged, simply secondary. The lead agent did not sit, did not move closer, he only inclined his head slightly, acknowledgement without submission. "We are already coordinated with your legal team," he replied, tone even, leaving no space for negotiation, and in that space, Alexander felt it, not fear, not yet, but displacement, like standing in a room that had quietly stopped belonging to him. Around the table, executives shifted in their seats, their confidence dissolving into careful silence, each one recalculating their position, their loyalty, their future, because power, real power, was never about who spoke the loudest, it was about who did not need to raise their voice at all. Outside the glass walls, more movement, more presence, the building itself responding to something larger than corporate protocol, and for the first time in years, Alexander found himself watching instead of being watched. Across the city, Imani Brooks stepped into a corridor lined with doors that bore no names, each one opening only to those who understood the weight of access. Her heels moved in the same measured cadence, her posture unchanged, because nothing about this moment required adjustment. It was not new to her, it was simply the continuation of a role she had never needed to announce. A woman approached her, tablet in hand, eyes focused yet respectful. "The initial response has begun," she said quietly. And Imani nodded once, her gaze steady, because response was expected, reaction was irrelevant, everything unfolding exactly as it should. Back at Hayes Global, the lead agent placed a folder on the table, not with force, not with emphasis, just enough to exist, and that was enough, because presence did not need theatrics to be felt. "We will need full transparency on several internal operations," he continued, and again, no accusation, no hostility, just certainty, the kind that did not come from assumption, but from knowledge. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his mind already moving through possibilities, connections, threats, but every path he followed led back to the same question he could not answer. Why now? What had shifted? What had triggered something this precise, this coordinated, this inevitable? His gaze drifted for a fraction of a second toward the city beyond the glass, toward a skyline he had always believed was his domain, and in that brief moment, something aligned, not clearly, not fully, but enough to unsettle, a memory of a quiet figure in a black dress, a presence he had dismissed, a silence he had mistaken for absence. The room remained still, the agents unmoved, the executives silent, and within that stillness, Alexander Hayes understood something he had never needed to consider before, that control, the kind he had built his entire life upon, could be taken without warning, without noise, without permission, and somewhere just beyond his reach, the one person he had chosen to overlook had already stepped into a position from which there was no longer any need to be seen to be powerful. Truth does not announce itself, it arrives quietly and then refuses to leave. The folder remained untouched for a moment too long, resting at the center of the table like something alive, something that carried weight beyond paper, and Alexander Hayes felt the room leaning toward it without anyone physically moving, attention drawn not by curiosity but by something closer to recognition, as if every person present understood that whatever lay inside had already begun to rewrite the balance they had trusted for years. He reached for it finally, controlled, deliberate, his fingers steady because they had never known hesitation, but the moment the cover lifted, something shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but internally, like a door opening to a space he had never considered entering. The documents were precise, structured, undeniable. References to transactions, communications, patterns that had existed beneath the surface of his empire, invisible to him yet mapped with a clarity that suggested long observation rather than sudden discovery. He did not react outwardly, his expression remained composed, but his mind moved faster now, connecting fragments, revisiting assumptions, searching for the origin of something this thorough, this exact. Because this was not coincidence, this was design. The lead agent watched him without interruption, not studying his reaction, not waiting for it, simply allowing the moment to unfold as it was meant to, because reaction was no longer the point, recognition was. Across the table, one of the executives shifted, a quiet movement that broke the stillness just enough to reveal what everyone else was holding back. Uncertainty had turned into awareness, and awareness was far more dangerous than fear, because it changed decisions before they were spoken. Alexander closed the folder slowly, placing it back on the table with the same measured control he had always relied on. But the silence that followed was different now, heavier, filled with questions that did not need to be voiced to exist. "You have been observing this for how long?" he asked, his tone even, but lacking the edge of authority it once carried, and the answer came without delay. "Long enough to understand it fully," the agent replied, and there was no challenge in his voice, no satisfaction, just fact, the kind that did not bend. That was when it became clear, not all at once, but enough to unsettle. This was not an interruption, this was a continuation, something that had begun long before the night at the gala, something that had been moving quietly through layers he had never needed to question. His gaze shifted again, not to the agents, not to the executives, but to the reflection in the glass. His own image staring back at him, composed, controlled, yet now slightly out of place in a frame that no longer centered him. A memory surfaced, subtle, almost dismissible, the way Imani Brooks had stood under the chandelier light, the way she had not reacted, not resisted, not even acknowledged the moment in the way anyone else would have, and for the first time, that memory did not feel insignificant, it felt intentional. Across the city, Imani stood in a room where screens displayed streams of information moving in quiet synchronization, her presence still, her attention focused not on the screens but on the pattern they formed, because patterns were where truth lived, not in noise, not in spectacle, but in repetition, in timing, in silence. A voice spoke behind her, measured, respectful. "The next phase is ready," and she did not turn immediately, she did not need to, because she already knew. This was never about exposure, it was about alignment, bringing what had always been hidden into a space where it could no longer remain unseen. Back at Hayes Global, Alexander exhaled slowly, a breath that carried more weight than he allowed anyone to notice, and in that breath, something shifted, not defeat, not yet, but realization, that whatever he was facing was not something he could negotiate, not something he could outmaneuver, because it did not operate on the same rules he had mastered. The room remained still, the agents unmoved, the executives silent, and in that stillness, one truth settled with quiet certainty: the moment he had dismissed her had not been the end of anything, it had been the beginning of something far greater than he had ever prepared for, and now, step by step, it was moving closer, not with noise, not with force, but with the kind of inevitability that could not be stopped once it had already begun. Power does not raise its voice when it is certain, it simply continues forward until everything else falls into place around it. The room at Hayes Global remained frozen in a silence that no one dared to break, not because they were told to be quiet, but because something larger than any of them had already taken control of the moment, and Alexander Hayes felt it more clearly now than ever before, not as a threat, but as a shift, a quiet displacement of authority that no amount of wealth or influence could immediately correct. He stood there, still composed, still calculating, but the certainty that had once guided every decision now felt thinner, like a surface stretched over something deeper he had never needed to confront. "We will begin with access to your internal records," the lead agent said, his tone unchanged, calm, precise, and the request did not feel like a request at all, it felt like the next step in something already decided. Alexander gave a slight nod, controlled, measured, because resistance would only reveal weakness. And weakness was something he had spent his entire life eliminating, yet even as he complied, his mind continued searching, moving through possibilities, revisiting alliances, questioning assumptions, until one thought, quiet but persistent, refused to be dismissed. Her. Across the city, Imani Brooks stood before a long table where several individuals reviewed data in silence, their focus absolute, their movements efficient, and yet every so often, a glance shifted toward her, not for approval, not for instruction, but for confirmation, as if her presence alone anchored the direction they followed. She did not speak, not immediately, because timing was not about urgency, it was about clarity, and when she finally did, her voice carried no excess, no hesitation. "Continue," a single word that moved through the room with quiet authority, aligning everything without force, back at the tower, Alexander stepped away from the conference table, the glass walls reflecting a version of him that looked unchanged, but felt different, as if the environment around him had recalibrated without his consent. Assistants moved more carefully now, conversations were shorter, more guarded, because uncertainty had entered a space that once thrived on predictability. He walked toward his office, each step deliberate, each movement controlled, yet the questions followed him, persistent, unavoidable. Why had she remained silent? Why had she not reacted? Why had she walked away as if nothing in that room held value? Inside his office, the city stretched before him, the same skyline, the same empire, but something in the view felt altered, not physically, but in meaning, because ownership was no longer as absolute as it had seemed the night before. He reached for his phone, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then lowered it again, because for the first time, he did not know who he was calling or what he would say. Across the city, Imani turned slightly, her gaze shifting toward a screen that displayed the unfolding response, layers aligning, actions connecting, not chaotic, not reactive, but precise, as if each step had been written long before it was executed. A man beside her spoke quietly. "They are beginning to understand," and she gave a small nod, not in satisfaction, but in acknowledgement, because understanding was never the goal. It was simply a stage in a process that would continue regardless of who recognized it. Back at Hayes Global, Alexander closed his office door, the soft click echoing more than it should have, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to stand still, not moving, not speaking, just thinking, because something undeniable had taken shape, something he could no longer ignore, that the silence he had dismissed. The woman he had overlooked had never been empty, it had been controlled, intentional, and now, step by step, it was revealing a reality in which he was no longer the one setting the terms, but the one being drawn into them. Reputation does not collapse in noise, it unravels in silence when people begin to look at you differently. By mid-afternoon, Hayes Global no longer moved with its usual rhythm, the polished confidence that once defined every hallway replaced by something quieter, more cautious. Conversations shortened, eyes lingered a second too long, and Alexander Hayes could feel it without anyone needing to say a word. The subtle shift from admiration to observation, from certainty to calculation. He stepped back into the executive floor, his presence still commanding space, but the reaction it triggered had changed, not dramatically, not yet, but enough to be noticed, enough to matter, because power was not only what you held, it was what others believed you held. The agents remained, moving through departments with quiet precision, their requests measured, their tone consistent, never raising their voices, never creating urgency, and yet everything around them adjusted as if urgency already existed. Alexander watched from behind glass walls, his hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, posture controlled, expression unreadable, but his thoughts no longer followed the simple lines of strategy and dominance. They moved in circles now, returning again and again to the same point, the same unanswered question, her. Across the city, Imani Brooks stood in a room where decisions were not debated but aligned, the atmosphere calm, deliberate, every movement purposeful, a contrast so complete to the chaos unfolding elsewhere that it almost felt like a different world entirely. She listened as updates were delivered in concise, measured tones, each one confirming that the process was advancing exactly as intended, not rushed, not delayed, but precise. "The internal response is stabilizing," one voice noted, and she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the information without emotion. Because stability was expected, disruption was only the beginning. What followed was structure, clarity, and truth. Back at the tower, Alexander moved through his office once more, the skyline still stretching before him, unchanged in appearance yet altered in meaning. His reflection in the glass no longer carried the same certainty it had the night before, and for the first time, he allowed the memory to surface fully, not just as a passing thought, but as something he examined. The way Imani had stood under the chandelier light, the way she had not defended herself, had not reacted, had not even engaged in the performance he had created for the room, and now, that absence of reaction felt less like weakness and more like control. He turned from the window, pacing once, slowly, deliberately, as if movement could bring clarity, but clarity did not come from motion, it came from realization, and realization was beginning to take shape whether he welcomed it or not. A notification appeared on his desk screen, a brief update, another request, another confirmation of the process moving forward, and with it, the quiet understanding that this was not a single event, this was a sequence, a design unfolding step by step. Across the city, Imani shifted her gaze to a Different display, one that showed the broader pattern, connections forming, outcomes aligning, and for a moment, her reflection caught in the glass surface, calm, composed, unchanged, because nothing about this required change, it required continuation. A voice behind her spoke softly, "The next stage will be visible," and she did not turn, did not respond immediately, because visibility was never about exposure. It was about timing, about allowing the truth to arrive exactly when it could no longer be ignored. Back at Hayes Global, Alexander stood still once more, the quiet of his office pressing in around him, and in that stillness, one realization settled with increasing clarity, that whatever he was facing was not reacting to him, it was moving independently of him, guided by something he had never seen, never questioned, and now, slowly but unmistakably, it was bringing him to a point where he would have no choice but to see it fully, and when that moment arrived, when the silence finally gave way to truth, everything he believed about control, about power, about himself, would be forced into a new shape he could not yet define. Some truths do not arrive as revelations, they arrive as recognition, quiet and undeniable, until everything else must rearrange itself around them. The late afternoon light stretched across the glass walls of Hayes Global, turning reflections sharper, more defined, as if the building itself was beginning to reveal details that had always been there but never examined, and Alexander Hayes stood at the center of it. No longer moving, no longer pacing, because movement no longer provided answers. Only stillness did. The door to his office opened with a controlled knock, his assistant stepping in with measured caution, her usual confidence replaced by something more restrained. "There is someone here to see you," she said, and there was something in her tone, not fear, not urgency, but recognition, as if she understood the weight of what she was announcing even if she did not fully comprehend it. Alexander did not respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on the skyline, because part of him already knew, not logically, not completely, but instinctively, the same way one recognizes a pattern before seeing its full shape. "Send them in," he said finally, his voice steady, controlled, the same voice he had always relied on, but it no longer carried the same certainty, not because it had changed, but because the room had. The door opened again, slowly, without drama, without announcement, and for a moment, nothing happened, just the quiet presence of someone stepping into a space that had once been entirely his. Imani Brooks entered without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, the same quiet composure she had carried the night before, but now, in this space, it did not read as silence, it read as authority. Alexander turned, fully now, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time since that night, he did not look past her, he looked at her, truly, completely, and in that moment, something aligned, not explanation, not justification, but recognition. She did not speak immediately, she did not need to, because the silence between them carried more meaning than any words could. It was no longer the silence of dismissal, it was the silence of understanding, the kind that arrives only when truth has already taken its place. Behind her, the lead agent stepped forward slightly, not to interrupt, not to lead, but to acknowledge, his posture shifting in a way that had not been visible before, a subtle straightening, a quiet respect, and then, without hesitation, his hand rose, not casually, not symbolically, but with precision, with intent, a salute. The room changed in that instant, not with sound, not with movement, but with meaning, because gestures like that did not happen without reason, they did not exist without structure, and Alexander felt it, unmistakably, the shift from uncertainty to clarity, from question to answer. Imani held his gaze for a second longer, her expression unchanged, not triumphant, not emotional, simply certain, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, carrying no excess. "We are done pretending," she said, and the words settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored, because they did not belong to the moment, they belonged to everything that had led to it. Alexander did not respond immediately, not because he did not have words, but because for the first time, words were not enough. The structure he had relied on, the control he had built, the certainty he had trusted, all of it stood in contrast to the reality now in front of him, a reality where the woman he had dismissed was not standing beneath him, but far beyond the reach of anything he had ever claimed. Outside the glass walls, the city continued as it always had, unaware, unchanged, but inside, something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone, and as Alexander stood there, facing the truth he had never considered, one realization settled with quiet finality, that the silence he had once mistaken for insignificance had never been empty, it had been waiting, and now, it had finally spoken. The truth does not need to raise its voice once it has been seen, it only needs to remain where it stands until everything else adjusts around it. The silence in Alexander Hayes's office was no longer uncertain, it was complete, settled into something undeniable as the weight of the moment reshaped the space itself, and for the first time in his life, he stood without the advantage of control, without the illusion that power belonged to him alone. Imani Brooks did not move forward, did not claim the room, because she did not need to. The room had already aligned itself around her presence, around the quiet authority that had never required recognition to exist. Alexander exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but it carried something unfamiliar, not defeat, not yet, but understanding, the kind that arrives when resistance no longer serves a purpose. You knew, he said finally, his voice steady but stripped of its former certainty, not a question, but a realization spoken aloud. Imani held his gaze, her expression calm, unwavering, and for a moment, the distance between them felt less like space and more like truth unfolding. I always know what I need to know, she replied, her tone measured, not cold, not emotional, simply exact, and the words settled with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. Behind her, the agents remained still, no longer the focus, no longer the source of disruption, because their presence had already fulfilled its purpose. They were not here to create power, they were here to acknowledge it. Alexander lowered his eyes briefly, not in submission, but in reflection, a gesture so small yet so significant because it had never existed before, his mind moving through everything he had built, everything he had believed, and seeing it now through a different lens, one that revealed not weakness, but limitation, the boundaries of a system he had mistaken for absolute. He looked back at her, fully this time, no longer seeing the quiet figure from the gala, no longer seeing someone beneath his world, but someone who had never belonged to it in the first place, someone who operated beyond it, above it, in ways he was only beginning to understand. Why did you stay? He asked, the question emerging not from authority, but from something closer to curiosity, even regret, and for the first time, there was no audience, no performance, just two people standing in the aftermath of truth. Imani paused, not because she needed time, but because the answer required precision, because leaving too early would have meant you never learned anything, she said, her voice soft, yet carrying more weight than anything spoken in that room before, and in that moment, the purpose of everything became clear. This was never about revenge, never about humiliation, it was about revelation, about allowing a truth to surface fully before it was acknowledged. Alexander nodded once, slowly, the motion deliberate, as if accepting something that could not be undone, could not be negotiated, only understood, and in that understanding, something within him shifted, not broken, not destroyed, but changed, reshaped by a reality he had never anticipated. Imani turned then, her movement smooth, unhurried, because nothing remained unfinished, nothing required further explanation, and as she walked toward the door, the agents followed without hesitation, their presence once again aligning behind her, not leading, not guiding, but respecting the path she set. The door closed quietly behind them, leaving Alexander alone in the space he had once ruled without question, and for a long moment, he did not move, did not speak, he simply stood there, the city stretching beyond the glass, unchanged yet somehow different, because now he saw it not as something he owned, but as something he existed within. The silence remained, but it no longer felt empty, it felt complete, and within that silence, one final truth settled with quiet certainty, that power was never about who stood in the spotlight, it was about who could step away from it and still command everything without saying a word.